Hi, this is Quinlan, and in this video, I'd like to talk about Buddhism in Japan. Now, when most people think about Japanese Buddhism, the first word that springs to mind is Zen. And you associate that with the Zen gardens, the Zen koan, those mysterious poems like, "What is the sound of one hand clapping?" and maybe tea ceremony or different aspects of the samurai code. Now, certainly those are a part of Japanese Buddhism, but they're just one piece of a much larger picture. In this video, I would like to introduce you to the vast diversity of traditions and schools that make up Buddhism in modern-day Japan, perhaps challenge some of your assumptions about what Buddhism and Buddhist monks are in modern Japanese society, and invite you to experience it for yourself if you're so inclined during your next visit to Japan. There are more than a dozen schools or sects of Japanese Buddhism in Japan, and that, I guess, shouldn't be too surprising considering that there are well over, I believe, 200 denominations of Christianity just in the United States alone. So that's perhaps natural. Now, of those 12, 3 are considered to be Zen Buddhist. Another component, perhaps the largest component of Buddhism in modern Japan, are what are called lay organizations, the most well-known of which is called SGI, or Soka Gakkai, and they claim membership of over 8 million households, and even have their own political party, the Komeito. Of course, Soka Gakkai isn't the only one of these modern lay organizations. I mean modern in that they were founded roughly 100-ish years ago, but they're a better topic for an old video of their own, or probably a long-form podcast, to be honest. One of the largest schools of Buddhism is actually Jodo Shinshu, which is relatively similar to Christianity in that the followers believe that just by saying the mantra, the prayer, Namu Amida Butsu, or I take refuge in Amida Buddha, that just by saying that, you are already saved and you'll be reborn in a paradise where you have eternity to achieve Buddhahood, studying at the foot of the Buddha. I find that kind of similar to Christianity because it's almost like saying that if you accept Jesus into your heart, that's enough, you'll be saved, as I believe some types of Christianity espouse. And of course there are still esoteric schools, tantric, if you will, schools of Japanese Buddhism that still exist, as well as some that are more sort of tied in with Shinto, more of a syncretism with shamanistic and Shinto elements as well. Now, I've lived in Japan for going on 25 years now, and over the years I've talked to probably hundreds of people about Buddhism because I did major. My undergraduate degree is in, Tibetan Buddhism, but it's a topic of interest to me. And so I was always surprised when I spoke with Japanese people about Buddhism in that the vast majority of people under, say, 50 didn't know what sect, what school of Buddhism their family belonged to. Most people do have a graveyard which is attached to a Buddhist temple. So technically, their family belongs to the type of Buddhism that temple is, generally speaking. There are exceptions to this, like people who follow Soka Gakkai or some of these modern sects, but generally speaking, that's the case. However, a lot of young people don't even know if they're Zen or Shingon or Tendai or whatever, which I always found kind of interesting, because I think most people in the States, even if you're not a practicing Christian, you probably know if your parents are Lutheran or Baptist or Catholic. Part of the reason why most people are technically a member of one type of Buddhism dates back to the feudal period, when there was a system devised called the Danka system. Danka can, I guess, loosely be translated as like a parishioner or a member of a temple, and the Tokugawa government used the temples to keep track of the common people. They all had to be registered with the temple, partially to prove they weren't Christians, and partially just as a way of controlling their movement and making sure that they could be properly taxed, etc., which may be part of what led to a huge backlash and suppression of Buddhism after the Civil War in the 1870s, but again, topic for another video. It's so hard for me to talk about this stuff because any little part leads to so many interesting tidbits and stories, but if I get too far into the weeds, I'll never explain the basics that I want to in this video. So anyway, of course, for most people, it doesn't really matter what type of Buddhism they are. I mean, there are big differences in them, both in their beliefs and their practices, but for most people, Buddhist practices really just consist of hiring a monk to conduct your funeral, more about that in a bit, and perhaps during the Obon holiday, which is either in mid-July or mid-August, depending on where in Japan you live, going to the graveyard and, again, having a monk conduct several rituals, also cleaning the grave, things like that. And the older generations will usually also have a home Buddhist altar where the more devout in the older generation will maybe offer incense or liquor or food on a regular basis. So here's something now that may be the most surprising. And that's that Buddhist monks, yes, including those Zen Buddhist monks and nuns, can get married, have kids, eat meat, and drink alcohol. It wasn't always that way. Until the 1870s, there were strict laws which were actually enforced by the Tokugawa shogun against monks doing those things. While a lot of infractions went unpunished, there were isolated cases through the end of the Edo period until the 1860s, when occasionally monastics in Japan would be beheaded for their infractions, though these were rare instances. The reason why all this changed is tied up with the Civil War and how the emperor took power back from the shogun and in trying to establish Shinto as a state religion and reduce the power of Buddhism. But this is a really fascinating topic that I don't want to do the injustice of summarizing too much. And so let's just say this is a great topic and I will talk about it at length in another video. In Japan today, being a monk is basically just a hereditary job, a family business, as it were. There's even a stereotype of monks in Japan driving BMWs and Mercedes-Benz and having Rolexes and nice watches like that. Quite the contrast with the image of the humble ascetic that you might have seen in movies or read about in books. But that is the way it is in Japan today. Monks' primary job now in modern Japan, their role is performing funerals and a few other rituals that are associated with commemorating the dead, memorializing those on certain days. And so in order to perform a funeral, basically you hire a monk from your temple where your graveyard is, and it costs anywhere from $2,000 to $5,000 US, depending on the region and the temple. And so for larger temples in big urban centers that have thousands of members of those temples, they could be performing a couple hundred or more funerals a year. Do the math on that. They make a lot of money. Of course, there are serious practitioners. Just yesterday, I was actually having coffee with a friend of mine who is a practicing Zen monk of the Soto school, and he half-jokingly told me that he estimated roughly 5% of monks in Japan today are actually serious practitioners of Buddhism. 5% may not be many, but considering the thousands and thousands of temples there are in Japan, that's actually a pretty considerable number. Also, just earlier this week, I was on my way to a hike and I stopped at a Lawson convenience store. And while I was buying my onigiri to bring with me to eat on the mountain, I saw a Buddhist monk in full robes standing outside the door of the convenience store with a begging bowl, bowing and doing some sort of ritual before they moved on. As soon as I paid for my stuff, I chased after them and found them just finishing their prayer in front of a nearby house. And I talked with them for a while, and it turned out it wasn't a monk, it was a nun. And she said she was doing something called takuhatsu, which is a technical Buddhist term that I'd never even heard of before, but it involves going around to homes and businesses symbolically begging and humbling yourself in the same manner that the historical Buddha did. I talked with her for about 10 minutes and learned that she is not from this area, and her parent was not a monk. She became a nun of her own accord based on her own devotion to Buddhist teachings, and the monastery where she is practicing, or I guess the temple rather, in northern Morioka is a temple with a handful of monks, none of whom come from hereditary monk families, and who are basically dedicated to the more traditional ascetic, impoverished style of Zen Buddhism. They get up every morning before 5 a.m., meditate for an hour, work in silence, have breakfast, listen to Dharma teachings from the abbot, and then go on some other type of religious training throughout the day, and are really living as devout Buddhist monks, as you might imagine from someone who'd studied Buddhism in the West. So these people do exist. In fact, I asked her if I could interview her or visit the temple and make a video sort of sharing this. And I talked to her head monk, the abbot of her monastery, via email, and he very politely declined, saying that he didn't believe that any amount of talking or videos would promote true knowledge, and that the only way that he felt comfortable sharing Buddhism was through actual practice. And so he invited me to come whether to stay overnight and then get up early the next morning and practice with them, or show up at 4:30 in the morning and join them in their silent meditation, labor, breakfast, etc. throughout the morning. And I plan to do just that sometime soon, but I haven't had time yet. Or maybe I'm just lazy. It's kind of hard to get up at 4 in the morning and go meditate, but I'll get to it, promise. So I do want to make clear that while I'm depicting monks as Mercedes-Benz driving, beer drinking, normal people, of course there are lots of exceptions. They're just a tiny percentage of the overall whole. If you're interested in trying out meditation or having a direct experience of Buddhism in Japan during your next visit, you don't necessarily have to get up at 4 in the morning to do that. There are a number of temples all over Japan that offer varying lengths, usually about an hour of sitting meditation. Sometimes it'll be a 20-minute meditation with explanation before and after for a total of 1 hour or an hour and a half. Some places this is free, and at the most expensive, it might be roughly 3,000 yen or $20–25 per person. If you are visiting northern Japan, I'd be happy to give you locations of places you can do this, introduce you to different temples that offer this service. And on the other hand, if you are really interested in visiting that ascetic temple that I mentioned, the one that has meditation from 5 in the morning, is rather strictly adhering to old rules, if you're able to speak a little bit of Japanese, you can communicate with them, be incredibly respectful of their discipline, then I, out of respect for them, don't want to openly post their information. But again, feel free to hit me up through gonorthjapan.com or Instagram or some other direct message, and I could then pass their contact information and location on to you if you're serious about that sort of more in-depth experience. Because they do welcome people who are willing to come and be respectful, and I would assume speak some degree of Japanese so that they're able to understand the rules. There's so much to say about Buddhism and Shinto, their relationship, all sorts of aspects of religious tradition in modern Japan. I really, if I had more time, in fact, I may do this. I kind of want to start a long-form podcast series just delving into esoteric traditions in Japan, because there is so much, and I personally find it so fascinating. But for the purposes of this video, I think this is probably a good place to end it. If you enjoyed this video and found this fascinating, please leave a comment or a question. Recently, I'm actually meeting quite often with a Zen Buddhist monk who is preparing for a trip to the States, during which they're going to give Dharma talks in English, and thus wants to practice talking about the Dharma in English with me. And so, because I'm meeting regularly with them, I could ask them questions for you. If anyone has any questions about Buddhism in Japan, Soto school, Zen, anything like that, yeah, put them in the comments, and I'll maybe drag them on for a video, or if nothing else, just share in a future video the answer to those questions. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you on the trails.